So welcome everyone. You've probably seen the bio already for Siobhan Bonisteel.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Okay, so as Steffanie said, my name is Siobhan Bonisteel. I would say that my work is really focused on what I call eco-social transformation through sustainable food systems. So I describe myself as an environmentalist and a local food advocate and researcher. In 2020, I founded Plant That Seed, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. It's a charity. Also this year we'll be launching the Climate Connection podcast. So in the podcast, we talk to experts in their field about whatever it is that they know and how it connects to climate change. So that's not just food, it could be a spiritual leader. This year I started my PhD at the University of Toronto in environmental science with a food systems focus. And mainly over the last decade, I've been working with organizations and community groups to develop their local food capacity. And really the goal has been to decrease food insecurity and adapt them to climate change. And that has manifested in many different ways, mainly working at the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank, where since 2016, we've grown more than 35,000 pounds. And we'll get into more detail about what that actually looks like as we go. Over a number of years, I conducted a local food study at all the food banks in Canada. So there's about 635 food banks in the country. And we called them all up to 5 times, depending on if they were culturally or geographically relevant. And we had a very good turnout. More than 70% of food banks got back to us. So we learned a lot about their local food work and also their barriers to doing local food. I'm a co-founder of the Preston Community Garden. We just finished our 8th season, which is quite incredible. And we'll get into why that's pretty incredible as we go. I want to talk to you a lot about Food Savers Club. Where this group diverts more than 16,000 pounds from landfill every year, turning into healthy meals. Also One Seed, One Community. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Steffanie mentioned some seed share programs, and also a number of other community food-based and poverty relief programs, such as Project Sprout, Project Protein, also working with the city on Bee Friendly Cambridge, and a local gleaning program. So as we go along, I'd really like us to keep in our mind this question: is it charity or is it justice? So that's something that you know, as I'm speaking, I hope that you can ponder, because hunger is not just an issue of charity; it's actually an issue of justice. And at the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank, probably one of the best lines that I've used in many of my presentations is by June Anderson, and she's the spiritual care provider for over 30 years at the food bank. And she would always say, "We mop the ocean with a paper towel." It's a big job and it's never ending. So mostly my work has been across these organizations, either for or in partnership with. And when we think about local food as a transformational agent, what we're seeing is local food helping to increase food security, belonging and social capital and cooperative learning among participants, justice, equity, and decolonization, also helping us as a community on the ground level to adapt to climate change, and teaching us all about ecological stewardship and what that actually looks like. This is Plant That Seed. So again, we formed in 2020, and Plant That Seed has a mission to eliminate poverty and adapt to climate change through local food systems. And we do that with the people in their community as leaders. So it's a nonprofit organization, and it helps community groups tackle poverty by providing local food development funds and local food training, including fresh food organizational visioning and development. And it's impactful for low-income people because it increases their access to fresh food while also increasing their food skills. Our vision is that every human has access to healthy, fresh food grown sustainably, locally, and in a regenerative process. And that for us is the root of what we call our food justice model. Our values are guided by the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. And we do this because we strive for earth care through sustainable and regenerative local food systems that care for the ecology. We facilitate people care through the building of social capital, programming, and healthy food access. And we promote fair share by facilitating the growth of local food systems in vulnerable communities with the vulnerable people as leaders. But also we support organizations like church communities and meal programs that have gardens where they grow food for donation. So really this is the intersecting space of environment and social issues with the goal of increasing food security among vulnerable people. So of course we have to ask ourselves the why. Why are we doing this work? Well, what we know, and these are statistics from Canada, so these are Canadian, is that the average income for people who are living in poverty is about $816.50 every month. But 69% is spent on rent and utilities. We can see here that rent is 31% of that number. So people are left with about $7.33 a day for everything, for all of their food, for any entertainment, and also, transportation. And what we know from research is that people actually skip meals for rent to be able to use the phone for transportation and to be able to pay their bills. I actually have never found a source for this. I would love to know where it came from, but it is quite excellent. And what we know is that in addition to $7.33 and the need to feed people who are living in poverty fresh, healthy food, that local food is better for a number of reasons. So we know that it has that it's better for the environment because we know that industrial farming has issues like soil erosion, salinization, desertification, and loss of soil fertility. Also, monocropping is really terrible for diversity and for pollinators. We also know that local food is really good for the economy. This is actually from the US, so these are not global statistics, but from the US alone, it's estimated that increasing the consumption of local food by only 5% could translate into a net benefit of over $100 million for the region. So when we buy locally, that the money circulates locally and helps the local economy. And the next really is health. So we know that disease is on the rise and has been since a reliance on industrial food. Also, herbicides and pesticides are dangerous for the planet, but also for our own health. And we know that pasture-raised animals have higher levels of omega-3s. So really, the local food movement is both an ecological one and a social one that benefits people's health. So our own region on their website talks about the benefits of community gardening. So while I study the overall benefit of the sustainable agricultural system, my work has mainly been in community gardens. And our region is quite aware of the benefits of community gardens, and this is what they say on their website. So community gardens support a more inclusive neighborhood by providing a chance for people to meet and work together. Community gardens increase healthier diets because they help people to eat locally grown fruits and vegetables that we know are not grown with pesticides and herbicides. Helps people with their physical and mental health, gets people outdoors and into physical activity. It increases access to affordable food. It increases food development skills through sharing ideas from various cultures. So, we see this in community gardens when people come from different places, and they teach each other different methods for how to grow some of their foods that they are culturally acquainted with. And it enhances environmental awareness. So people learn that growing food locally means things like less fossil fuels. So when we're thinking about local food in an organization, what we've come to understand is that an organization is only as progressive as they decide to be, which is first based on the knowledge of the why. Justice is then the direction or action an organization takes based on the understanding of this why, which then becomes embedded within the organizational structure. Only when local food and its value is embedded within the organization's mission does it have real impact within the food charity system. So then the question is, how does local food benefit a nonprofit charity? How does it benefit a nonprofit charity to engage with local food systems? And that's because a nonprofit organization is still a business. So really, they need to have an incentive to engage with local food. And the question is, why should they? What we've come to understand is that there are many, many ways that an organization, a food charity organization, will benefit from engaging in local food. So the first is fresh food procurement. So if you're feeding people and you engage in local food, you're going to have a higher access to fresh food. And chances are, if it's grown in partnership with a community garden, it's free. So you've got fresh food in a quite an accessible, easy way. And that, of course, increases the health of your participants. Some people might refer to them as clients, but if you hear me use the term participant, I'm talking about the people that an organization serves. So this, of course, leads to overall fresh donations because you are engaging the community in a different way, and people are learning about you and understanding that your organization even takes fresh. So, in the food banking system, most people think about cans. They think about a canned-based system and putting food into a grocery store bin. But a lot of food banks actually take fresh food. So this engaging in local food is starting a different narrative about your organization and allowing people to know that you actually take fresh food. Local food engages an organization in many new partnerships. So if you're a can-based organization and you're maybe relying on donations only from larger industrial food systems, you're not creating partnerships that are local with the other organizations in your community. So digging into your local food system will inevitably produce partnerships that you wouldn't even think of. Often it creates engagement in a healthy food system and research opportunities. So an example would be one of our gardens participated in a blind carrot study. So we did about 100 feet of carrots, and they were different seeds, and we didn't know which ones they were. We just marked the row. So every 10 feet, it was a different carrot variety. And what that did for us was it allowed us to study and understand what varieties were going to grow the best in our climate. And what that means is that these gardens have the opportunity to become sites where we understand what we need to do to adapt to climate change. So when you think about that, to have a food bank be engaged or a food charity organization of any kind to be engaged with that level of research is really quite innovative. And from that, we know that there's eco-social benefits. So we've listed some of them, people getting healthier by being in the garden, but also this preemptive eco-social benefit of understanding our climate and what we need to have a food system here. Another big one for organizations is their PR and messaging. If you are engaged, if you're environmental stewards, if you're engaged in a local food system, you are progressive, and it's a really great way to get donors to support you in your overall mission. Leadership. If we are considering the context in which our organizations currently exist within, then we can't help but be conscious of the fact that we are living in the era of an ecological crisis. So when an organization acknowledges this and then they do something about it, they become leaders. They become leaders in this eco-social transformative counterbalance to the ecological crisis that we currently face. So realistically, it's a lot of birds with one stone. You are both doing the right thing by caring for the environment, but you're also positioning yourself as a leader within this context. We found that through local food in these organizations that there is a great story for corporate groups and donors. We've also been able to engage many hundreds of people through their corporations. So having businesses come out to the garden to volunteer, for example, really sort of connects the organization right back to their donor. And often in food charity, we have a little bit of a misnomer, which is we think about the participant or the person we serve as our customer. And in reality, the customer is actually the donor. It's the person who is donating their money. So realistically, we're not, we're Robin Hood. We're not stealing from the rich to feed the poor. But what we do is we schmooze the rich to feed the poor. We engage them. We get them excited about the work we're doing. And then we take that money and we use it for good things. So what we sell to people with money is inspiration. We sell them this eco-social vision for a better world. And then we use that money to do good things. So by having a local food vision, it's really an engagement tool with your donor. Also, the education and workshops that are created for the participant, we'll go through that more as we go. I'll give you some examples. But there's nothing quite like local food as a tool for education and creating workshops. And that, of course, leads to participant engagement. And really, when we're looking at a food justice model, it isn't just about feeding people. It's not about a handout. It's about engaging people in their food system and helping them to become leaders and to make to have a voice and to make choices themselves about the charity system. And then, of course, that leads to overall community engagement. So why this photo? This is the golden milestone in Rome. It's the monument to Caesar. And the saying is, all roads lead to Rome. So really what this is at the center, we think about this as the organization. And there's many, many roads here, and it all flows to the organization. So whether it's environmental stewardship or leadership or fresh food procurement, it's all benefiting the core, which is the organization. So really what I want to talk about today as we go along and dive deeper into is what is happening currently in the Waterloo region within the food charity system. So most people don't realize, but there's what we call the Food Assistance Network in the region of Waterloo. And the Food Assistance Network is actually made up of two food banks, the Food Bank of Waterloo Region and the Cambridge Food Bank. And those two food banks serve collectively more than 100 community programs and agencies. So most of the food, or a lot of the food, a giant portion of the food that is used in food charity in our region is actually coming from the Food Assistance Network. For example, 34,408 men, women, and children were served by the network in 2017 alone. We know from COVID, of course, that those numbers actually grew during the pandemic, and they haven't actually decreased. But this gives us an idea of the size of the food charity network in the region, which is actually quite huge. This is an example of one of the agencies that are being served. So this is Trinity Community Table, and they're in Cambridge, and they're within Trinity Anglican Church, and they serve about 120 people 3 days a week. And that's a hot meal, and they also do a to-go bagged sandwich. So it's many, many hundreds of meals every week. And this group is just an incredible group of volunteers. And Shauna, who is a board member, decided that she really wanted to have a garden, because why not supplement some of what their food needs are with a garden? So I helped them do some consulting and come up with some vision planning, and they really just ran with it. And they've been at Rare for a number of years now, and they're growing enough food to do at least a salad for that many people 3 times a week. So, you know, when we ask ourselves, well, what's really important about that? If we go back to the second slide, the $7.33 a day, if somebody is reliant on food charity in order to feed themselves, then I think we can ascertain that the quality of the food that they get really matters. So it might be that, so for example, in Cambridge, you can get a meal a day. There's a number of organizations that offer meal programs. The Cambridge Food Bank is one of them. And it works out to about a meal a day if you are, so this is not a hamper program. This is not a food that you're taking to go and prepare at home, but food that you're eating that's already prepared for you, which is especially necessary for people who are living on the streets because they don't have the ability to cook. So if you're getting 1 meal a day, it has to be a meal that is nutritious and healthy and good for you, and not, let's say, craft dinner. So these organizations are really becoming leaders who are noticing that the quality of the food that they feed people is really essential, and they're really stepping up to the plate to do that. So this is, you know, one of over 100 agencies in the region that are doing some of this work. I want to introduce you now to the Cambridge Food Bank. They serve all of Cambridge and North Dumfries, and it translates to about 1,600 families a month that are reliant on the food bank directly. And they directly serve people through their emergency food hamper program, but also through a number of programs. And one of the newest and most exciting things is that they launched a mobile fresh market. So now they're entering into communities with a bus that's full of fresh food, and it's set up a lot like a farmer's market. And for $5, people leave with full bags full of fresh food. And actually, what's pretty radical about it is that they've come to include the whole community. So you don't have to be a member of the food bank to shop there. But the idea is delivering fresh, healthy food that's accessible into the communities where people are the most food insecure. In addition to these 1,600 families and direct service, the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank also serves over 20 agencies. So the Trinity Community Table that I introduced you to is one of those agencies. So it's truly an incredible organization. One thing to think about is that there is no one size fits all model in the food charity system. Every organization is very different. So the Food Bank of Waterloo compared to the Cambridge Food Bank is a really good contrasting example of this. So the Food Bank of Waterloo Region doesn't do direct service. There are no people who live in food insecurity who go directly to the food bank to pick up hampers, and they do no programming. Instead, they are a much larger distribution center that moves many tons of food directly to agencies. So if you're somebody who's living in food insecurity in Kitchener, you're going to go instead to another organization like the House of Friendship to pick up your hamper. If you are in Cambridge, you will go to the Cambridge Food Bank to pick up your hamper, and you'll also potentially come to the meal program on Saturday mornings. But you'll probably also go to organizations like the Trinity Community Table for a meal. And together, these two very different food banks make up the network. And, you know, we could actually talk for hours just about the differences in food banks and food charity. One of the things that is quite interesting to discuss is the concept of local food centers and whether they're better, because food banks have had a lot of criticism, and certainly rightfully so, by poverty and food advocates, mainly around the reality that food banks are a band-aid solution. And the argument is that in the government being allowed to have a band-aid solution, they're not doing their job of feeding people properly. So for example, if we're looking at a true food justice model, many would argue that a radical redistribution of the world's wealth and minimum income guarantees for people would really be the way to provide justice. Now, food banks would probably tell you that, number one, they never claimed to provide everybody's food needs. They are what they call supplementary food. So a food bank is actually designed to be your stopgap. It's your emergency. And really, they were born out of the 80s, the early 80s, when we had a recession, and it was neighbors helping neighbors. So the first food banks actually started out of the trunks of people's cars, including the Cambridge Food Bank. They are, which is partly why I really love them, because really they are grassroots community response to poverty. They are quite literally neighbors helping neighbors. And in that way, the food bank is, any food bank is truly owned by their community. So the Cambridge Food Bank, for example, relies on more than 80% of what they do is genuinely coming from the Cambridge community. It's people putting cans into grocery bins, and it's people donating directly to their local food bank. So it's really quite a rich history. But what's interesting is that this local food center model came out, and really they were doing local food in a much more progressive and better way. And they were focusing on fresh food for people in need. So many food banks have taken up that torch, such as the Cambridge Food Bank. And now, arguably, we're entering an era where these two are sort of meeting, and it's really hard to tell the difference. In a lot of ways, the Cambridge Food Bank is a local food center now. And because they are much larger, they've been around since the 80s, they're quite embedded in the community. In some ways, they're able to do that job better than a local food center because of their size. So in many ways, part of being a local food advocate is encouraging these food banks to take up the local food torch, because they have the infrastructure to do that in a really, really good way. So I really want to talk to you a little bit in detail about what has happened at the Cambridge Food Bank since 2016. And my role there up until only a few months ago, leaving to do my PhD and to run Plant That Seed, has been food procurement manager and local food development manager. And that means that I managed all of the approximately 85,000 pounds that entered the building, and then how it moved out through the system, which meant our distribution center and our pickups, or our drivers or guys on the truck, but also all of local food development. And prior to 2014, when I started doing this work first with the Preston Community Garden, we really were mainly a can system. And I went to the board and sort of spoke to them and said, you know, it's sort of ludicrous to rely on cans in the summer. Our grandparents would have never done that before. And now it's a revolutionary act to grow food. But realistically, if this was my great grandmother's time, she wasn't getting any awards for growing food and not eating her preserves in the summer. You would be crazy to eat your preserves in August. There's a reason why people preserve the harvest and keep it into the winter. And here we were relying on canned food in August, when we have an incredible climate for growing food. And certainly, the more you become passionate about local food, the more you walk around and realize all these spaces where food could be grown. So myself and a small community group thought, well, why don't we start growing food for the food bank? And this was in 2014. By 2016, I had started co-managing the more than 30,000 square feet at the Rare Charitable Research Reserve. And between 2016 and 2020, 2014 and 2020, we have grown over 35,000 pounds. Rare is growing approximately 10,000 pounds a year. And what that translates into is more than 130,000 plates, or 300,000 servings. This is a photo of me in front of one of our larger harvests. So it's important to show that photo, because this is the volume that we're working with So this is an important discussion, and it has to do with pounds. At food banks, we measure things by weight, but of course, there's a lot wrong with that measurement because weight doesn't do things like capture nutrient density. It doesn't capture the difference between, say, Kraft Dinner and kale. And also some of the healthiest food on the planet is the lightest. It doesn't weigh anything. So I decided to do an experiment. I took 4 pounds of kale from one of our gardens and I brought it up to the kitchen. This is the kitchen at the Cambridge Food Bank. And I created 38 heaping dinner plates full of kale. So this is what you get for 4 pounds of kale. It's a lot. Of course, this is sort of ridiculous because nobody eats one big heaping dinner plate of kale for dinner. So if you turn that into 4, you're at 4 times that as far as a serving goes. So really, this is more to highlight the absurdity of trying to capture the value of food through pounds, but it's what we have. So it's what we're working with here. But we can see how far light greens goes. So of course, there was a lot of debating at the food bank for a long time, because if we were gearing our community gardens to pounds, we'd grow pumpkins. And but that's not, in my opinion, the value of a community garden. The value of a community garden is in its engagement with people. It's in the education it can provide the community, and it's in the nutrients that it's able to grow, and it's filling the gap. So if we have a lot of Kraft Dinner, and our food bank gardens are growing pumpkins, you now have Kraft Dinner and like a pumpkin. But if your garden is growing a rainbow of food and it's growing all of these light greens like lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, spinach, you are filling this nutrient gap for people without focusing on sort of the number that you produce. So we talked a little bit about reasons why an organization might want to engage in local food. And one of them is that you are inspiring the community. So I want to show this photo because this is quite literally the result of inspiring the community. This is what it looks like. This is not grown in our garden. This is grown in other people's gardens. These are grown in local farms. So when people catch wind of the fact that the food bank wants fresh food, this is what ends up coming through the doors. So while we calculated 35,000 pounds of what we have grown ourselves, it's not capturing the many other thousands of pounds that have come through the door based on the work itself inspiring the community overall. Okay, so the Cambridge Food Bank is doing this local food work across 5 community gardens in Cambridge and North Dumfries. The largest one is at the Rare Charitable Research Reserve. The Rare Charitable Research Reserve, for those who don't know, is just under 1,000 acres of land kept in trust and in perpetuity for future generations. And one of their largest projects is their Springbank Community Garden. And in this garden, the Cambridge Food Bank has 15,000 square feet. So half of that is a organic road garden. You can see that in the top left here. And we use sustainable agricultural practices like crop rotation. There's no inputs put onto this garden, and other than manure, but no pesticides or herbicides. And then, if you can see in the top left photo, there's a fence, and then behind that, there's a lot of little white dots. Those are actually trees. That's a fruit orchard that was planted in 2017 and 18. And as of this year, we really started producing fruit. So there's about 75 fruit trees of varying varieties. And the point here was that we were thinking in terms of future generations, and thinking that as the years go by, this guild will produce more and more food for people in need. This is another picture of the garden. You can see some volunteers in the garden. They are doing a corporate day of caring. So we worked really closely with the United Way to do to participate in their Days of Caring program. So working with local businesses or corporations to come out and spend their time in the garden. So what's really valuable about some of these pictures, and it's really hard to tell, is that this is the community coming together quite literally, because what we have here is we have members of a corporate group. We also have members of the program itself, so participants in the food bank, people who are living in poverty, and we have staff. We have staff at RARE and also staff at the food bank. And what ends up happening here is that people just come together. If you stop and you listen, you hear conversations like, "Oh, my grandfather used to be a farmer. He really, really loved. He taught me all this cool thing about carrots." And someone else will say, "Wow, my grandma was really a gardener, not a farmer, but a gardener. And some of my favorite memories are being with her in her garden." And when it ends up happening is that people don't know who's poor and who's not poor, and instead they're just a community. And really, when you're in those moments, that's when you feel at a personal level that this is food justice, not food charity. And the other main garden that the Cambridge Food Bank works with is the Preston Community Garden. So I mentioned that in the beginning, and the Preston Community Garden, again, is in their 8th season. And what's really special about this garden is that 8 years ago, myself and 4 other people decided to start this garden, and we worked really closely with the city to identify the best site. And we picked Sturdy Park, which is over 4 hectares. It's a very, very large green space in the heart of Preston. And there's many reasons to pick a particular site for a community garden, and one of them is accessibility. People need to be able to walk to their community garden or be close to their community garden. Issues of water or parking is another one. And then, of course, where it's not obtrusive, where it can be in a place that is not, invading anybody else's space. So Sturdy Park really did that because it was such a large unused green space. And unfortunately, what happened, which I'll never forget for the rest of my life, is that when we had city permission to start the garden, a petition against the garden by local residents happened, and it ended up being 250 signatures long. And our little garden in 2014 became the site of a citywide policy debate. And our garden is really quite small. It's only about 80 feet by 100 feet, very, very tiny. And I thought to myself, okay, well, now we have to fight this at council. And I'm not a math person, but we had an engineer on site, and I dug around in the city's city records, and I figured out that Sturdy Park was over 4 hectares. And I knew how big our garden was, and I said to the engineer, I want to know what our percentage is of the park space that we're taking up. And it came back that we were about 1.6 to 2% of the entire green space. It was just a drop. So we took those numbers to council, and we brought in many experts in the city, in the region, on community gardens, including Greg Michaelenko, who used to teach at the University of Waterloo. And we won. And unfortunately, as time went by, it turned out that a lot of people were given misinformation, that we were going to build roads and all sorts of things, which is why they signed the petition. And later, over the years, we've converted most of those 250 naysayers into loving this garden. There was a lot of conflict. A lot of really mean things were said. One of the things that was said in the petition was that against the garden was that we would attract homeless people to the garden, and that Preston didn't want homeless people. So of course, our reaction was to create homeless gardens for the food bank and to grow food for people who are living on the streets. So realistically, that's an example of resistance, taking such a terrible comment and turning it into a community response to homelessness and poverty. Ultimately, we still have some of the main people who dislike us still not liking us 8 years later, but we've always maintained that our job is to embody the values of the community and community gardens. So when people have been cruel to us or photographed us or stood there with their binoculars, we always wave and smile and continue gardening. And I think it's certainly a testament that if you put goodness in the world and you keep going and you keep growing, eventually that goodness really does spread, and it's allowed us over 8 years to become a staple in the community. Another garden that is really important to the Cambridge Food Bank is Hope Garden. Now, Hope Garden is a really good example of how different models, how there are many different models that can create gardens. So Hope Garden is actually on the land of VIG Computers. So they are a corporation, they're a business, and they have had space, and they let us they let us dig up their land. So we dug up this land and we planted, and we created a partnership with the Islamic School of Cambridge because they're quite close to there. So it created the opportunity for students to come to the garden, for students to plant at the garden. It also created incredible relationships with the Islamic community in Cambridge. And really what it shows as food researchers is that there are so many different models for community garden. There is no one size fits all. So Rare is a very large charitable research reserve with over, as I said, almost 1,000 acres. The Preston Community Garden is on city land, and they have different struggles. One of their main struggles is water. There's no water there, so we have water trucked in throughout the summer. And then here is a privately owned business, so somebody who is a landowner. And here there is actually a hose because it's hooked up to the building. So they have a different set of challenges, and it's quite a different looking garden with different partners. So in this case, it's a school. In the case of the Preston Community Garden, it's the library. So, really each garden is very unique. The fourth garden that has been really important to the food bank is what we call Greens on Queen. Greens on Queen is located in Hespeler, and this is actually a private home. This is a landowner. This is Jen and her husband in the top right, and they purchased the lot beside their house. And I think they had plans at some point to do a swimming pool. And one day Jen had heard us on the radio talking about our community gardens, what we were doing to grow food for people in need. And she was looking out over this grassy area, which actually had an old dying tree. And she thought, I'm not going to do what I thought I was going to do anytime soon. What if we turn it into a garden for the food bank? So Jen had the tree removed, and we supported her and doing a lot of sort of planning and consulting. And Jen is just an incredible person. She's really on fire. And she went out and got sponsors from all of the businesses in the area and created this garden. And for the last few years, Jen has been growing passionately food for the food bank. The other point here worth mentioning is that this work really requires what we might call local food champions. So somebody who's really passionate, who takes up the torch. And Jen is a really good example of that. So she's really embodying the energy of what it takes to create community gardens and hopefully inspiring other people. So anybody, you could be growing in containers and donating it to the food bank, or eating it yourself. But certainly a lot of people have access to something like an extra piece of land or area in their own space that they're not utilizing. And so Jen is a really good example of using that space to do something really incredible in your community. The other garden that was really important to the food bank for quite some time was called Minjamin Dun, and Minjamin Dun is no longer, but Minjamin Dun was a strong force in the community in 2018 and 2019. And Minjamin Dun is an Indigenous garden that was at the Rowe Charitable Research Reserve and is the vision of Dr. Andrew Judge. And we worked with Andrew during this period of time to expand Minjamin Dun. We received the $50,000 innovation grant from the region, and really the focus on the expansion, certainly in 2019, was on workshops. So we were able, through Minjamin Dun and Dr. Andrew Judge, to really bring out participants and people in the community to learn about Indigenous land-based practices, Indigenous food systems, and also, because it was in the orchard of the food bank, to really connect people back to the overall project of growing food for people in need. And there was a number of really exciting workshops. We did planting, sustainable habitat design, maintaining the garden. We had harvesting celebrations, and then we've brought people back to the food bank to do some food prep. This work is also continuing through, and I'm sure that Steffanie can speak to this at a later date, but Conestoga has received quite a large grant to do some Indigenous land-based practices, and they're expanding and creating gardens, and continuing working with RARE to bring especially Indigenous students out to the land to do some hands-on work around Indigenous food systems and land-based practices. So really this also spurred the Cambridge Food Bank in wanting to do more Indigenous work. And that included, for us, we took on an Indigenous student to completely revamp our land acknowledgement, which for us wasn't just about sort of redrafting this paper, but it was about looking at how to create a living document, something that is alive and breathing within the organization. So for us, it meant a lot more gatherings and working together and sitting together and talking through colonization and looking at the ways that many of our participants were being impacted by colonization, and thinking a lot about Indigenous food and how to really bring that into the food donation system. For anyone who's a foodie, this is this is the good part, all these great pictures. So I wanted to show here, this is what some of our food donation looks like. This is what food looks like when it is grown and it comes out of the garden. And really, we could talk for hours about the ugly food movement, that food looks a certain way in grocery stores, that actually means that there's a lot of food waste because of only accepting food that is in a particular shape or color. So really, I could get on a soapbox about this because there's a lot of implications for this, and that is that when a person is living in poverty, it really matters the quality of the food that they receive. So if somebody is used to going to the grocery store and seeing things look really pretty, and then they come to a food bank and they get things that they don't recognize or that look really ugly, they feel themselves like garbage. There's not a lot of dignity sometimes attached to food that isn't what we recognize. So what does that mean for a food charity organization? Well, it means a number of things. One, it means education. It means letting people know that, it means communication. It means letting people know that this is the best food. This is the expensive food. This is the food that is grown in the best, most healthy way possible, even though sometimes it's weird looking. So we talk a lot to people. We talk about the food and the quality of it. We create signs and we communicate to people. The other thing that we do, and you'll see as we go along, is that we cook this food. If you cook this food and turn it into meals, then it all looks the same. And it's a really great way, you know, to get healthy food into bellies. So we talked a little bit about education and programming. So I wanted to give an idea of some of what these gardens are doing. So while, you know, a mandate at a food charity organization is to get food into people's bellies, there's all of this incredible domino effect that's happening here that has to do with local food and the ways that it creates a swell of community excitement. So an example only from 2019, and like I said, this work has been going on much longer than just 1 year. This is what happened in 2019 alone. So we did yoga in the garden. We offered free yoga to the community, so get people out and stretching and moving and being on the land. We had a kids local food programming. So that meant we had a series of 4 kids programs, including movement in the garden. We played with dirt. We had another one all about seeds and pollinators. We ran a kids garden club where we brought kids who live in poverty on a school bus every week out to the garden, and they got to, you know, grow food and be in the dirt, as well as do crafts outside and be in the garden. We also have and had a garden club. So every Wednesday mornings from May to October, participants and volunteers would go out to the rare Springbank garden. And you know, these are adults. These are adults who use the food bank. Sometimes kids come, but mainly this program was geared towards adults who live in working poverty. We also had a really exciting garden launch where all of the kids from the Islamic School of Cambridge from grades K to 6 came out to plant at the Bishop Garden. And we had a Go Fresh series where we had preserve workshops and all about the importance of eating green food. What the heck to do with kale, because there's so much of it and sometimes people don't know what to do with it. So we did stuff like that. And then at the top in the sort of the middle, you can see me at a school. So in 2019, I think I did 500 seed plantings with kids across the region. So that would give us an opportunity to talk about the food bank as well as poverty and the importance of local food systems. These are our kids from the Islamic School of Cambridge out at the Hope Garden. So, you know, you can see their adorable faces and how exciting it is for kids to just be able to be on the land and plant. I mentioned going out to schools and doing plantings with kids, and really this gave me an opportunity to talk about all of the organizations that were sort of working to support this work. We had partnerships with the library, with Seeds of Diversity, which is one of the largest seed-saving nonprofits that I've ever, I think in Canada, that I know of anyway, and they happen to be in our region, which is incredibly exciting. If you get a chance to learn about them, I would highly recommend it. The Community Gardens Council of Waterloo Region, so we would show maps of all of the community gardens in the region to kids and be able to talk about some of the incredible work that's come out of the council, which includes some really good research on the benefits of community gardens, and then RARE, who I've already spoken of. So some of the incredible programming that we've done at the food bank has been quite broad, but one of them is our gleaning program. So I like what I call, when I go into organizations and do some consulting for them, I really like what I call the low-hanging fruit approach. So normally organizations complicate things. They look for really complex ways to sort of have solutions, and often the solution is really right in our face. So gleaning is a really good example of that, because it takes a lot of labor to procure food, to find food, to get food into bellies, to move food through the system. And it's rather absurd to be sourcing food and looking for food and begging grocery stores for food when there's all this free food on fruit trees that are rotting. So, you know, the gleaning program is a low-hanging fruit approach. We quite simply, in partnership with the Preston Community Garden, offer anyone in the community with a fruit tree the service of us going and picking it and taking it to the food bank. I found that most people really want to get rid of their fruit by the time we come. They're rather overwhelmed. And sadly, I also discovered that a lot of people were putting their food into garbage bags and throwing it out because they didn't really know what to do with it. So at one point I went to City Council and brought them the gleaning program. So I was really hoping that the city would develop a fruit tree registry, which unfortunately wasn't taken up. But the idea was that anybody should be able to register these fruit trees so that we as a group can go out and harvest from them. And what I said to the city was that they have a poverty issue, getting food into bellies, but they also have a very expensive food waste problem, where food is being wrapped in garbage bags and thrown in a landfill and producing methane. So, you know, when we're talking and circling back to the concept of food justice, this is a really good example of that, because we're wasting a lot of food that could really and truly end up being used by people who really require the nutrients. Another thing that we do at the food bank is a seed share program. And since its launch, this is just an example. So this slide actually was developed in 2019, and at the launch in the early spring, we had already given out over 1,000 packets of seeds. And last year alone, there was close to 2,000 packets given out. So, you know, we are at many, many, many thousands of seeds being distributed through the program. And when we look at the slide that talked about benefits to an organization by having local food, this is an example of being progressive. So most food banks are giving out, you know, a basket that might have a focus on non-perishables, so canned goods. And this food bank isn't just giving you food, it's giving you seeds so that you can grow food yourself. And then, of course, there's a lot of education around this because you can't just give people seeds. You need to teach them what to do with them. So we created a lot of focus on container gardening. We also gave out soil and containers. And then the other big one for this program is a focus on microgreens and sprouts, because anybody can do that in their kitchen. Project Protein is another example of some of these local food projects. We began working with Quinta Quinoa. They're actually a quinoa grower in Canada, one of the only large scale growers in Canada, and they're working all over the country with a lot of focus actually in Alberta. And they are developing more and more sustainable methods for growing quinoa. But what's really incredible about this organization is that they have picked a quinoa seed that's based on nutrient density. A lot of what we grow is actually based on yields. And it doesn't really matter how nutrient dense it is. And this founder actually had a lot of health issues and developed this quinoa specifically to feed people high nutrient food, and has become very passionate about working with food banks. So we created Project Protein that really was about looking at sustainable creative solutions to increasing protein. And quinoa is very, very, very high in protein, and it's plant-based. So it also is important for cultures that don't eat meat and need other protein sources. So this, this is an exciting project that hopefully other food banks will also take on. What do you do with it? How do you teach people how to use quinoa? We've had a lot of challenges there. And one of the things that we decided to do is to create a quinoa cook-off. So we brought in participants, we brought in staff, and we created multiple dishes from quinoa. So you can see on the plate on the left, we have quinoa salad and a quinoa dessert. And I think that's a quinoa shepherd's pie. So we invited everybody in to taste it, to cook with it, and then we distributed it. And it's through these sort of community acts of eating together and cooking together that people get excited about something new. So it's also a food bank's job to truly engage people so that they know why something is something that would be good for them, that they should be doing. Project Sprout, in 2019, we received $20,000 through a grant with Food Banks Canada to do more with youth. So we created more youth engagement programs at the garden. And one of the main things was that we created an indoor year-round microgreen growing station and program. So we started growing our own microgreens and then distributing them to people as they came in. And then this led us to Goodleaf. So Goodleaf is a sprouts microgreen company in Guelph, and they had a lot of surplus. So they would, let's say, do a run of their sprouts, and in the food production world, generally speaking, you grow what you can sell. So if they had plans to sell X amount to Loblaws, let's say, and then for some reason they didn't order as much or it wasn't needed, they would be left with these boxes of microgreens. And unfortunately, what happens in the food world is a lot of that is put into the landfill. So we came in and started working with them and started distributing these microgreens through the system. And at one point we were saturated. It was too much for our food bank, but because we're part of the Food Assistance Network, we were able to move this through Food Bank of Waterloo also. And in that way, we were able to absorb all of this surplus of sprouts without them going into the landfill. And speaking of landfill, so in 2018, when I took over managing of all of food for the food bank, we received a skid of zucchinis, about 4,000 pounds. And most of those zucchinis were bad. The ends were soft, and half of them were rotten, and they smelled, some of them smelled very, very bad. So a lot of our work in the distribution center is quite literally gleaning, working through rotting produce. And I thought to myself, okay, traditionally this all goes in the landfill. And the reason is there's no dignity attached to food like that. If you're a person who's living in poverty and you walk into a food charity organization and you're handed something that is soft on the ends, you feel like garbage. It's already bad enough to be there in the first place. So to protect people, because the Cambridge Food Bank is very, radically aligned to the well-being of the people they serve, they would get rid of it. And as maybe most of you know, in the region, we don't have compost programs or green bin programs for businesses. So the landfill's free, friends. And that 4,000 pounds was mainly going in the landfill. But I thought to myself, hold on, if I was at home, I would chop those soft ends off, I would chop the middle of the zucchini, and I would freeze it, or I'd cook with it. We're a commercial kitchen, why can't we do that? So I really like things to be named what they are. So I came up with Food Savers Club for saving food. And it sort of had this feeling of like a superhero saving food. And it literally started with myself and Diane McLeod, who is now the executive director, us just chopping this ridiculous amount of zucchinis. And then I started to think, well, how do I build this into a program? And also, how do I create a leadership role for somebody who lives in poverty? So we ended up getting funding. I hired somebody who lives in poverty and who uses the services of the food bank. And to our amazement, in 2019, we saved more than 16,000 pounds from landfill and turned it into just under 13,000 meals for people in need. So there's a lot significant about that. The first thing is that healthy, good food is not ending up in a landfill, which is absolutely devastating to the environment. The next thing is, from a practical standpoint, it's a resource for an organization. That's 16,000 pounds that staff doesn't have to procure in some other way. It's a better use of the resources that were already there. And then the next thing is that if you're somebody who's homeless, or your life is a pressure cooker, you're already struggling, you don't have to cook. You're getting a healthy, fresh meal made with vegetables that didn't take your time to do it. So realistically, this program has been truly revolutionary at this organization. And the hope here for me has been that to create models that other people can copy. I actually don't believe in copyright in community work. I think we want to do things that people get excited about and that they copy also, that has uptake. So realistically, I think that any food organization who is taking donations, if we're willing to look at the underbelly of it, what we'll find is that there's a lot of food waste. And there's a lot of food waste for a number of reasons. The example of the skids of zucchini where half of it's bad. Another example is that you just get too much of something. So if you get 4,000 pounds of zucchini and it's all good, but you've already moved it. You've moved it to all of your agencies. You've given it to participants. Everybody is sick of zucchini. They can't take any more. What do you do with it? Well, often it secretly ends up in a landfill. But here, if you turn it into meals and you freeze it and you cook with it, you turn it into programming, you can use it later. You can give it out in a few months when people aren't so sick of zucchini anymore. And they get it in a different way. So it's a really, really good way in a distribution center context to control flow of food resources. The big projects at the food bank, so when we're talking about food waste, is this partnership with the Compost Council of Canada. So it took 2 years. Myself and the council applied to multiple grants, and eventually we got a $30,000 Trillium grant. And through this $30,000, we purchased an on-site industrial composter. This is the Actium composter. And these are really used mainly on industrial farms. It'll actually compost an entire pig, for example. And really it was developed mainly for farmers, because if you have an animal, for example, on your farm that dies, you don't really want to bury it because it will attract, coyotes and other things to come to your farm. So what do you do with it? Well, you put it in this giant stomach, really. It's a giant digester. And the Compost Council, which is an incredible organization who's been around for quite a long time, really got passionate about the idea of these being available to food banks, because we have a lot of food waste. And I will say, I'll give the proviso there that it's not because food banks are wasteful. It's because we get people's waste. So for example, a grocery store is going to get something fresh and they have a few days or a couple of weeks to get it out the door. And there's a lot of pressure for them to move that product. There's more pressure on a food bank because we get it when it's at that 50% off stage, or it's already going bad. And we pick up just containers of what often is half garbage. So then the question is, well, whose food waste is it? Is it the food banks who's taking it to the landfill, or is it the communities, or is it the corporation who's getting a tax write-off for giving you part garbage? And as a food bank, you can't say no to that because we're gleaners. And if we say no, then we put a barrier up to organizations giving to us. So we take it. And in taking it, it means that there's a lot of extra food waste. So this is an incredible solution to that. Instead of taking it to the landfill, we can digest it on site. So I've talked a lot about programming. This is an example of the life that we pumped into our kitchen over the last few years. One of my favorite programs, and I know we're getting short on time, so I'm going to not go into all of these here, but I do want to quickly talk about Global Kitchen. Global Kitchen was something that we started in 2019 with, we've got a picture of Chai Tali there. She's an incredible woman, just an incredible nutritionist, and just has such a beautiful, contagious energy and love of food about her. And what she did was she created Global Kitchen, and every month participants would cook their way to another country. So it wasn't just a sort of like a food experience. It was also looking at ingredients, food habits, customs, traditions, beliefs. She would talk about these different communities and cultures, and people would get a chance to eat from that part of the world. So some of the countries, for example, that people went to was India, China, Mexico, and Italy. So that was really exciting. And also it's compatible with community gardens. So if we knew that Chai was really interested in a particular food from a particular country, then we could grow that in our garden for the program, and then you would be connecting the dots there. The food bank has a wellness hub for kids, so that was a very easy connect to our gardens, bringing kids out to the garden and teaching them about food, and then bringing them back into the kitchen and into the wellness hub where they could eat it. Another really important program for food banks in Canada is Grow a Row, Give a Row. So really sort of encouraging, and the Compost Council actually is one of the leads in that many years ago. And the idea is that you encourage gardeners, regular people who are growing food, to plant an extra row of food for people in need and to give it to your food bank. These are more examples of workshops that we were doing at the food bank: sprouts, microgreens, preserves, cooking classes, and these are nutritionists that we would bring in to teach people. And then you see a lot of participants here in the photo, and they're learning how to cook with the food that we're growing. This is out at the garden doing workshops there, seed saving workshops, garlic workshops. And then One Seed, One Community. is really an incredible project. That's the food bank, Rare Idea Exchange, which is our library system in Cambridge, Seeds of Diversity, who I've already spoken of, and everybody came together to create One Seed, One Community. You can see the team leads in the photo on the cover of Idea magazine. And we have distributed in 2 years more than 80,000 seeds for free through the library system, mainly through the seed savings, seed share program, sorry, at the food bank, and also through Rare. So we, and 40,000 of those seeds were the Cascadia pea, which was distributed in a pandemic. So we still managed in the pandemic to get those seeds out to the community. Here is the opening of the seed share program. And there's some city councilors who came out to do a ribbon cutting. And this is the Idea Exchange garden that is a part of their kids program that I helped consult on to create that garden. So that garden is a number of years old now, and certainly a staple in the Library of Preston. And back to the concept of, PR. Why is it good for an organization to engage in local food? Well, all of this work at the Cambridge Food Bank helped us to receive the Ontario Local Food Champion Award from the Minister of Agriculture. So really, it's in this progressive eco-social work that these nonprofits are, I believe, able to sort of lead the charge for climate change adaptation, to really redefine food security, and in doing so is clearly putting themselves on the map. So in closing, I want to go back to the first question, which is it charity or is it justice? And to leave us with the thought of we mop the ocean with a paper towel. So I would say that there's a lot that isn't working about food charity. And certainly I think Steffanie is exploring that much more deeply in this course as we go along. And it would take many, many hours to do more of that here. And I know that I'm out of time. So there's a lot problematic with the food charity model. And yet it's what we have. People are hungry today. And to me, infusing that system with healthy, local, fresh, organic, making it accessible to people who need it, is a very logical response to the current situation.